Okay, so we are here today to interview Professor Daniel Lichter, who is currently the Ferris Family Professor of Life Course Research at Cornell University, has been very, very active in demography over his career, and is a past PAA president. In fact, president in 2012, at which time you were, Professor Lichter, the 75th PAA president. I'd like to start, of course, with some personal demographics, if you don't mind. I have in my spreadsheet of past PAA presidents that you were born in 1953. Is that correct, or am I wrong?
That's right, 1953.
Okay.
In California.
Oh, you're born in California.
Well, my dad was a South Dakota farm boy, and so was my mother. And he went into the Marines during the Korean conflict, and I was born at Camp Pendleton, I think, or just outside.
Wow. Right. Okay. So
But then they returned. But then they returned to South Dakota, and so most of my life I grew up as a child. I grew up in South Dakota, in Mitchell.
In Mitchell. Okay. So do you know Wentworth, South Dakota?
Wentworth
or Madison? Are you familiar?
I know Madison. That's not too far from Mitchell.
Okay, good, because in fact, my mother-in-law was born and raised in Wentworth near Madison, one of 12 children to Danish immigrants.
So I'm one of 11 children to German Catholic, but I go back to maybe the 1860s, 1870s.
Wow. Okay. Okay. Very good.
So 11 kids.
Yeah. Well,
I have 7 younger brothers.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But you weren't Hutterite, I understand.
No, I'm no Hutterite, but I might as well have been, sort of natural fertility. They're devout Catholics.
And so now you said though that you actually grew up on the farm there in
No, my dad was he was trained when he was in the Marines as an electrician, and he came back to South Dakota and was in public utilities, a public utility company, electrical company. So he was a working class guy, high school education, and he worked for the same company for 40 years, 50 years, whatever it is.
Oh, wow. Wow. Okay.
So we were not the moneyed class by any means.
Well, no, but still, you've got deep roots in terms of what the changing demographics of the country has been over time, which you've done a lot of work.
I agree with that. Fertility, yeah. I hit that one, pretty good, and migration, I hit that one, and
right.
Mortality, that's going to come in a couple of years, maybe.
So now, how many of your siblings are still alive? Are they all still alive? Or
they're all alive. They're all alive.
Okay. Okay. Wow. Very good.
My dad passed away a couple of years ago. My mother's 90, I think 93. She still lives in Mitchell.
Okay. Okay. Very good. So now that of course explains why you would go to the other SDSU, as we call it here in San Diego, South Dakota State University.
Yeah, I have to look every time when I see those in the paper, because I never know whether it's South Dakota State or whether it's San Diego State.
I know. Well,
so I have to check.
Yeah, it's what the South Dakota State Jackrabbits, is that right?
The Jackrabbits, yep.
The Jackrabbits versus the Aztecs. Yeah, there's at least a difference in how the teams look on that score.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, so tell us a bit. Let's go through your childhood up to going to college and so forth, and give us a bit of that history, just so that everybody who's reading this interview has some sense of where you come from, because those are the things that we really like to know about, especially in the beginning, because people can read your publications and know the great work that you've done, the great insight that you have, and we like to know how that all came about.
Well, I grew up I think my father, and mother, when they came back from California, started out in some really small towns in South Dakota. My dad was working, I think, in a town about 40 miles away. But then I think maybe when it was 4 or 5, they moved to Mitchell, and I spent my entire childhood there. Was always enrolled in Catholic schools until the high school closed up when I was a junior, which is probably the best thing that ever happened to me because I got exposed to a whole different group of people as a senior. My parents are devout Catholics. I think I had, when my older sister, I have one older sister, I think when she was 8, we already had 7 kids in the family. And so, I think the thing that sort of is different during that period from what I think probably our kids' experiences is, we didn't get a lot of attention, and we were on our own. We were pretty resilient. I think we were, we took care of ourselves and took care of each other, because my mom, it was sort of a traditional family until we got into high school. Did a lot of babysitting, did a lot of chores, worked hard, saved our money. I think by the time I went to college, I think I had like $4,500 in the bank, working jobs for, $1.10 an hour, I think I was getting. And of course that paid, I think my parents didn't give me any money for college, but I think I ended up, I think in the end I borrowed $600, go to 4 years of college. Of course, those days are no longer possible. And why I always think we need to, all these state universities, they pull back their financial support, for colleges. If you want to go to college, you need to pay for college. It's just sort of the neoliberal kind of thinking. And so I'm happy when we try to do more for those kids, because I think we're wasting a lot of human potential potentially. And so I think the best thing that I always say as a sociologist, the best thing I have going for me is my sort of rural working class background. And, I think we're hungrier. I think we have a different perspective on things that's different. And I see that today when I'm at Cornell, or as opposed to maybe some other, I've been in public universities too. There's not the sense of entitlement and that sort of thing. So I went to South Dakota State. Didn't have any major in mind particularly. Never even thought about moving to a college outside of South Dakota. I went to someplace that I could afford, and took some sociology classes from some really boring sociologists, at the time. But I loved reading. I loved the perspective. I was really interested in family and class and poverty and that sort of thing. And so I majored in sociology. My parents and friends weren't particularly happy about that. They didn't understand what that meant. But I thought, well, I'll be a better person. I didn't have job considerations in mind at all. And I did well. And then I went to Iowa State University, which was a big deal for anybody in the family to leave the state. I remember having I have something like 70 cousins, 71st cousins, something like that. And they all converged after I graduated from college, because I was going off to the big time, to Iowa State, which was about 5 hours away, in another small town. And I went there for 2 years, got my master's degree, and then I decided I was going to go to Wisconsin. I was going to go somewhere to work on some other issues, because I had some other kinds of topics I was interested in. So I went there, was there for 4 years. And that's where I really sort of became a demographer, in the sense that when I got there, I was working for Glenn Fugate, who was a rural sociologist, past president of the Rural Society. And he did a lot of work on rural America and small town America, growth and decline, migration, that sort of thing. And what kind of places, the dying rural village, that sort of thing. And so I was interested in community sociology, and everybody said, well, you're going to be a demographer if you're going to work for Glenn. And I ended up appreciating demography, because there was some, it wasn't all, there were sort of rules about how you measured things like fertility or mortality or migration. There were some conventions. I could believe it wasn't BS or a lot of verbiage. It was sort of the facts. And I was interested in family and fertility. I was interested in rural communities. And And so that was sort of my segue into the field. And so I've always had a interest, if you look at my resume, in rural issues. And that comes from my background. I've always had an interest in family, and that probably comes from my background. This is what they call me search. People kind of study the things that they study. But I've also done a lot of work over time on race issues and things like that. We had Native American Indians living in town in my hometown that came off the reservation. There was a reservation not too far from us, maybe 30 miles. So I was always sensitive to these kind of issues. And I still remember going to college, and I think I maybe met my first African American fellow student. Maybe that was the first time, and it was sort of a shocking, just because I'd never had any experience with that. Now, the thing that was different about Mitchell, it's the home of the world's only corn palace. I don't know if you've ever heard of the corn palace, but it's a big monument to corn, I guess. It's a big palace with corn murals, and they have a big celebration. They've done this for 150 years. They had John Philip Sousa in there, Lawrence Welk, all the, as a sort of celebration to the harvest, fall harvest. It was always in. So there was this sort of cosmopolitan part to that rural environment too, because there was always families coming through from Chicago on their way to the Yellowstone or wherever. And so, we saw a lot of kids that way. And then it's also home to Wesleyan University, which at the time was a very small school, maybe 800 kids, but they always had a good basketball program. And they always brought in African-American kids from Chicago or elsewhere. So I used to deliver newspapers in the dorm. So there were always Black young adults there too, so that it was sort of interesting. So I always argue that, I'm sort of a rural cosmopolitan. I never really, people think we're sort of rural rubes, but, in some sense, the rural people, they're exposed to urban culture. What urban people aren't is exposed to rural culture very much. And I always felt that, but I always wanted to go to urban areas. I mean, one of the big events in my childhood was that I went with my brothers and a couple of my brothers and I, we wanted to go to see the Minnesota Twins in Minneapolis. And I remember driving with my dad up there to see the ball games. This was back in the 60s, maybe when I was 10 or 12. But, I never thought much about it. But, each of us kids, we paid for our own food. We paid for our hotel. We paid for the ticket to the ballpark. And, we were on our own pretty much, So we learned how to save money. We were never going overboard. Our parents started savings accounts and stuff for us right away when we were young. So that's, it was sort of the German thing, and they never ever said anything nice about it. The parents would never say anything to give you a compliment or anything, because, that was against the strict German stuff, and they didn't want us all to get a big head. Now, they did that with the maybe 4 or 5 oldest kids, but they never did that with the younger kids, because they realized they probably messed up. We're all neurotic, the younger ones are maybe better balanced. And of course, they had more money than I did. I lived as well when I was 21 as I'd ever lived in my life, probably. I had more money then than I ever had when I was a kid, probably. With all these TAs now and RAs in college, they're all, they all get wound up because they're not getting paid enough, and they're not. But that was good living for me, when I had my own TA or RA at Iowa State and then at Wisconsin. So then I went to Penn State. I was there for 17 years. Went through the ranks, became center director of the Pop Center there. Went through one renewal. Then I remarried. I had a divorce in, I don't know, I guess early the 1990s. And I had full legal custody of my 2 children. They were 10 and 14. And they lived with me all the time. And I learned how to be a mama, so to speak. I understood the emotional labor involved with being a single mother, and without really any support of other single men, because they didn't tend to have their kids. And so I learned a lot in terms of being a parent, a single parent. And then I remarried after those kids all left for college. Those two kids went to college, and I remarried Sharon Sassler, who's also a sociologist. And we then moved together. We both got a joint positions at Ohio State. And then I was never going to leave Ohio State, but then said I'd only move from Ohio State if I had some position in a policy program, because I always had an applied interest. They always have a big rural social program, or did at the time, and are quantitatively oriented and concerned about poverty and inequality and things at Cornell. And they came through with offers for both of us. So I was director there. I was a founding director of the Pop Center at Ohio State. And then I also was involved in running the Pop Center at Cornell too. I started with the Bronfenbrenner Life Course Center, which I was the director. And I said, we don't need this Bronfenbrenner Life Course Center. You know, it's just, it was like a one-man shop. And so I talked to the dean, and we folded it into and made it into a population center. We got NIH support for that, but we didn't keep it. We didn't get enough grants, but that was one of the challenging things, is a faculty that's not particularly used to getting external grant money. So that was always my charge, is try to figure out how we develop the staff and expertise to help faculty there, but also how do we get the faculty motivated to do that kind of big, large scale research? And that's always it's almost a cultural problem or a cultural issue. So I probably already rambled on long enough here about this. So that's where I am. And then I just retired a couple of years ago. So I was also director of the university's Institute for the Social Sciences, which is the umbrella social science unit on campus. And these were the same sort of charges I had. We were trying to figure out how to, bring, I always called it boutique sociology, just doing the sort of one-man studies, and how do we bring big science big social science to the campus, build teams, interdisciplinary teams of researchers. So I always like economists. I always like population geographers too. I like the spatial dimensions. When I was at both Penn State and Ohio State, I really pushed these spatial analysis cores with GIS and that sort of thing. And Ohio State and Penn State both have really good geography programs, and Cornell has its planning program, but they've lost all their geographers. But I think geography is coming back a little bit on the population sciences with the technology. So I've been at Penn State, or was at Penn State, for about 16 years, I guess. And then I retired at the end of 2020 with the COVID. I decided, time for me to move on. The university was restructuring the social sciences, and also moving my policy department into a school of public policy. So I just thought now's the time to pass the torch. But I'm not really retired. I'm still doing my research and having fun, but I'm doing the John Weeks model,
Well, let me just say, Dan, by the way, I'm going to let the others ask the questions, because my 10-year-old German Shepherd here thinks that he should be part of the conversation, but his English isn't always as good as we might like. And before I let others ask questions, I should just say that we were mentioning my mother-in-law, who grew up in South Dakota. She actually, I think it was in 1939, was the corn husking queen in Mitchell.
Oh, really? Wow. Wow. Impressive.
Yeah, we actually have a photo of the page from the newspaper with her in that. So we do know all about that, at least in our household.
Great.
Okay, and by the way, I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, but I call the members of the community my Cornell Mafia, because Karen Hardy, Dennis Hodgson, and Wim Brown, all three have their doctorates from Cornell. So they may well have some specific questions about what's going on back there right now. And
actually, John, can I ask a question about that? And the question is about the center at,
Sound on.
there was the
Can you hear me?
program at rural sociology
It fixed the echo.
was in the School of Human Ecology, probably renamed. but-
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about what the two different centers did?
I don't know if you guys heard, did you guys hear the question?
A little bit.
Yeah, the main program for a long time there was Stikos, I think, ran this population and development program, which still exists.
That was
You
mine.
know, is that you were in that?
I think we're all graduates. Are we all graduates of Stikos?
Yeah, you know, I don't know that I ever met Stikos. Stikos had already retired, I think. Maybe he didn't even passed away before I got there in 2005. So they've always had that program there, and they get a lot of students with international interests and so on. And so when I came in as the Pop Center director, you know, my goal was it was to sort of break down some of these institutional boundaries. I mean, sociology was a bit antagonistic toward demographers in general. I remember Charlie Hirschman and others, they left the sociology department because it was so difficult. You know, demography wasn't the most popular discipline. It was too applied in many people's minds. But my goal was always to bring all these disparate units together. And most sociologists at Cornell are outside of the sociology department. And so I was always interested in bringing these other people into the fold, so to speak. And I actually thought I was pretty successful doing that, because I had a lot of people from I mean, most of the rural sociologists, rural demographers were involved in our center. In fact, I think my original assistant director, associate director, I can't remember what it was now, was from DSOC, from what's now Development Social, and it's moved on to global, I think global studies or something, which came after I left. But so they've always been an important part of the program. I've been involved with students there, many different students over the years. But I also wanted to build bridges to economics and other parts of the university, the planning program, and so on. And also I've always, you know, I was jointly appointed. You know, I was a no cost joint appointment in the sociology department after I was there a year or two. They wanted me to come in, sort of help them a bit. And so I was on recruitment committees and so on. And if you look even at the mainstream sociology department, you know, we've hired a lot of demographically oriented sociologists. At the same time, the disciplinary boundaries of sociology have become more expansive and permeable, I guess you'd say. They're, you know, what is the dean would always say, is everything demographic? And I would say yes, which wasn't very satisfying. But we also had we had a really strong group at the time when I was at Penn State, and then also at Ohio State. And this is less true at Cornell, but I've always tried to get the biologically oriented people, the biodemography and the physical anthropologists and stuff. I remember one of my happiest days was when one of the graduate students in anthropology looked at a paper in American Antique or Antiquity or whatever, and was looking at these life table estimates of some prehistoric population and saying, these just don't look right. And then we sat down together and realized that, you know, they were calculating life tables, but they had abridged life tables, and they were multiplying every 5-year age group by 1. So they had a little bit of an underestimate of anyway, so I always enjoyed those kids a lot. And so I've always tried to be interdisciplinary, eclectic, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand the various disciplines. I mean, I just love the culture of, I shouldn't say love, I love being interested in the culture of economics, because economics is such a different kind of field from sociologists. I mean, they're just much more of a hierarchy. There's a way to do everything. There's a certain set of topics that are important to study and others that are not so important to study. And you guys may not agree with me on everything. And then sociologists, we're all over the place. I've had colleagues in my department at Cornell who, they tell the students that they have to, go read a little bit of sociology, get some ideas, and then do the analysis right, because, they're always trying to solve the endogeneity problem. And as sociologists, what's the endogeneity problem? I mean, nobody has any choice, and the economists, it's all about choice, So it's just two different worlds. So I always appreciate whenever I would try to hire sociologists at Cornell or in policy in particular, I would always argue that you're going to be a better sociologist hanging out with these economists, even if you don't. The secret is just don't get assimilated by them, still maintain your sort of structural perspective. And, with my presidential address, the economists weren't happy because, race is not a variable in their mind. And, why would we care about a variable that's a fixed, it's not, and that's not the point. The point is that people's reaction to race is a variable. And how do we change society in a way that's more inclusive? So, I mean, I had my old economist friends from Penn State. They were mad at me. I remember talking to many of them. They said, I said, what would you do? I mean, we've got issues of race and structural racism, or we're all woke now, I guess, in the academic. What would you do? And the economists always said, I wouldn't do anything. And it's just the market will take care of this. That was sort of their attitude. And so I would always, I have a good relationship with economists generally, but I tweak them too. I tweak them a little bit, and that was a particular case after my PAA address.
I've got one question for you, particularly in the context of your background.
Yeah.
I can see how growing up in South Dakota in a rural place, it's so reflective in what you've done in terms of research. It's there. The curiosity I have is that if you think about the discipline, particularly at the time you're going to graduate studies, you're getting your PhD 81. I got my PhD in 76. And I was with the STICOS program, which was in sociology at that time. And it was all, we've got to do something about the population explosion in developing world. It was huge. And when I look at your work, there's nothing like that in it. And I'm curious, I'm thinking, I remember when I read Matthew Connelly's book, Fatal Misconception.
Yeah.
He's an historian and he dedicates it to his parents for having 8 kids. And he's right up there in the front in the introduction. He says, no way I believe there was a population problem. And I'm curious about being one of 11 in an environment, in a discipline at the time you were going through, particularly, I guess, at Wisconsin. There was this sort of emphasis on high fertility in developing countries and the problematic nature of high fertility. Whether or not your sort of personal upbringing might have sort of moved you away from an interest in what was at that point in time a huge component of demography.
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question because I don't have a real good I don't have a real good answer to that because I was never really exposed that much either as a high school student or we had other fish to fry. I grew up, I lived about 2 blocks across the highway from George McGovern when I was a kid, and I turned 18 when he was elected, met him out at the airport when he flew into Mitchell Municipal Airport, and I canvassed for the guy and everything. But I don't know why that wasn't really on my mental map very much. It just wasn't. And, my parents were not very educated. We didn't have books around the house. They didn't talk about anything. My dad worked all the time, and my mother worked with kids all the time, pretty much. And I went out, the kids all went out and raised hell. You know, I wasn't a particularly good student. I was probably street smart, but I wasn't very academic. I mean, I didn't get serious about academics really until I got into school and, you know, I was spending my own money. So I don't know if the population bomb, you know, I always cover that stuff in my classes. I always teach that stuff, you know, all that historical, you know, the Ehrlich, and I show films on it and all this stuff.
Right.
And then, you know, following the debates and, you know, the latest bet and that sort of thing. And, but that was never part of my mental map. It was more of, you know, poor rural people who are sort of left behind, you know,
Right.
that, and it was always a domestic, you know, I didn't really get into the international issues until, you know, I took my first sabbatical about 10, 12 years ago. I went and spent a year in the Netherlands. And then you know, I should have done that when I was younger, you know, but, you know, it's kind of funny when you grow up as I did, you know, with sort of working class parents, not very well educated, not terribly sophisticated, very religious. My dad would say, you know, religion, it's harder to get to heaven, you know, when you're, you know, or if I would tell him about some statistical study of mine about the relationship between X and Y, and so he would say, well, where does God fit into this, Dan? Where does God
Right.
fit in? You know, it's sort of the idea that, you know, God's managing, you know, micromanaging everyday life. And, you know, God's going to take care of the bomb of the, you know, population growth and so on. So I don't know, it was never part of the way I thought. And even at Wisconsin, you know, Wisconsin was always, when I went there as a graduate student, it was always criticized because they didn't have a big international program.
Right.
And that's a fair criticism. And not many economists either to worry about development issues and very much either. So I don't have a good explanation other than I was, you know, it was just not part of my formative experience. I didn't really get probably really interested in that until the economist was saying there's no problem, you know, we'll solve this. And it was the fellow, Julian Simon, you know, read his
Right.
book, and, you know, I talk about that in my class. And Julian Simon's son was actually at Cornell too, when I was there, when I first started there. And, you know, they didn't realize their dad was such a, you know, controversial
person.
figure, the demographers back then. So,
I have a follow-up question on
okay.
that. So, you know, when I saw your CV and I saw that you had done your PhD at Wisconsin, I thought, oh, of course, Dan Lichter went to Wisconsin because, you know, in comparison to like Michigan or Chicago or Cornell at that time, Wisconsin was much more focused on domestic issues, on issues of socioeconomic inequality. So in my mind, seeing what you work on, it made perfect sense to me that you had gone to Wisconsin because that department, that pop center didn't have the same emphasis on overseas population control that a lot of others did. And so I'm wondering if you went to Wisconsin because it was a good place to focus on the issues that you wanted to focus on, or if going to Wisconsin helped push you toward studying poverty and inequality.
Did you guys all hear that? Did you hear what she said, or, oh, you did? Okay,
Yes.
good. You know, my attraction to Wisconsin, I think, you know, it was reasonably close to South Dakota and my family. You know, I could still get there in a day's drive. I think that was one part of it. But I was looking for departments that were more technical. I mean, in Wisconsin at the time was, you know, they were at the leading edge, and, you know, you had all these guys that were doing just phenomenal demographic work and sociological work, social science work. You know, they were quantitative, statistical in ways that most other departments were, including the Iowa State where I was. You know, Iowa State now had a big international development group there, and the ag economists there were all, you know, very much involved in international development. But I think it was a technical side, and it was highly ranked. They also had, you know, this is a period when you had Jim Sweet and Larry Bumpus and all these guys were doing so many interesting things. You know, they did that national survey of families and households. You know, they had all that event history data. So we were all jumping on board with the survival models and log linear models were the rage. We had people in the stat department there and had a very applied interest. So I wanted to do work that I always would say to people, I want to do work that my mother understood, that I could explain to her rather than some esoteric thing that nobody cares about. I always told my Cornell colleagues that, I'd get them mad sometimes, but they knew I was just tweaking. I was that, they were doing boutique sociology and I wanted to do work that mattered. And that to me was more applied work and demography to me, when I got exposed to it, took some classes, were exposed to Jim Sweet and Larry Bumpus and Marta Tinda when she was there, and Bob Hauser was there, and David Featherman, all these guys doing quantitative work that had even with stratification, people always had a kind of a demographic orientation, and they came to the population meetings. So I think my first population meetings must have been about 1978, maybe. We drove all the way from Madison, me and 3 other graduate students, to Atlanta, I think, and that was just an eye-opening experience for me to watch serious people talk about serious topics and be credible. It wasn't BS, it wasn't a lot of baloney, and it made sense because the mathematics of it, I was always good in mathematics. And it was just, I love to take a rate and sort of break it into pieces and try to understand why something's changing. And so here were a group of professionals that I just, admired, just the way they attacked the problem. That's why I like economists. I mean, I don't know if you agrees with economists, but the good thing about economists is they always, I love the way they break a problem down, even if, I don't always agree with their perspective and how they interpret data, but I just appreciate how they think about causal analysis and that sort of thing. And I share that with, my views with my students. I'm always, trying to get them to think more eclectically about the social sciences, not being wedded too much to their own disciplines. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I've got a question for you. So in the context of when you began, you were sort of missing all that sort of highly political component that was in the discipline of demography at the time, in terms of high fertility and all that kind of stuff. But I think where you've ended up right now is that what you do is the hottest political topic possible. Now I go back and I take a look
Which are you talking about? What, the rural stuff
No, I'm talking about like a presidential PAA address. If I remember correctly,
it was, I'm very interested in that.
Integration or fragmentation, racial diversity and the American future. It was wonderful. I just reread it for the interview today. And to some extent, it's so topical, particularly your presentation about the future. I mean, you focus on the child cohort, and it's already minority majority. And you say in the future, it's just going to get more and more minority majority. And
I always
look at what we're doing to these kids. They're impoverished, they have lousy housing, lousy education, lousy healthcare. And there was really a policy component. We've got to do something for those kids because they're America's future.
Exactly. That was my message. That's been my message. And
today it's the same thing. Exactly. Now, if you think about how political that has become all of a sudden in the context of US politics, that's it. You try to give help to kids, and what happens? We had a wonderful pandemic program that lasted 1 year, and it reduced child poverty tremendously.
Right. And
then we have absolutely no one pushing for it. And it's basically hitting at your point. To some extent, it seems obvious that unless we do something major, this is going to be a terrible thing for the country to let this generation.
I agree 100%. I mean, if we don't invest in kids today, we're in big trouble. And this is going to come on us way, way faster than we even can imagine. I mean, the baby boom is I'm right there at the baby boom, we're not gonna be around too much longer. So what's gonna happen? Well, we're gonna make some space we better make some space for this very diverse population, or we're in big trouble, I think, unless I don't know what the alternatives to doing that are. I think we just have to do that. That's why I never understand that, just to do a little politics here. I just don't understand why Republicans don't want to become a little more inclusive. They could get the Hispanic vote, they could get the Asian vote. I don't think they'd ever get the Black vote, but seems like they could get these populations. It's not like anything's going to change. I mean, we wrote a paper on population development review with Ken Johnson maybe 10, 12 years ago. And we were looking at, not just, we could cut off the borders right now and eliminate every immigrant, but, it's built into the system with fertility. We got this big second order effect of fertility with, younger immigrants who are having kids. It's just not going to change. And it may slow but it's not going to, reverse to good old America in 1950 or anything, it's just not. So I'm always an advocate for kids, and probably the most receptive audience I ever had when I've talked about this maybe was when I gave a university lecture at BYU, which is very family oriented. I came in for a university lecture, and they were very, very receptive, because they believe in supporting kids, even if they may be conservative on other dimensions. And that was a good experience for me. And I've always sort of been a friend of BYU over the year, doing various things. They're very activist. We went to a food bank, and of course they proselytize immigrants and that sort of thing, but I think they care about people and in their own way.
So are you optimistic that we're going to get this rich white baby boom generation to funnel the resources that are needed to have a successful socialization of that growing young?
Well, I was worried, been worried that, everybody thinks we're going to keep going, in a positive, more inclusive way. And my PA address was really a cautionary lesson to that, because I didn't think that was the case based on what I saw firsthand when I'd go back to South Dakota, say. And so I don't know what, I don't know, with the Trump era and everything, it's just hard to know what's going to happen here. I worry a little bit about being like Brazil, I guess. I don't know enough about Brazil to say, but it's sort of a white minority that kind of runs the show, basically. So I worry that we're sort of re-institutionalizing institutional racism that in a way that's gonna, strengthen the hold of the white elite, to the white middle class and upper middle class and wealthy people to run the country as they always have. That's what I worry about, especially we get into voter suppression and this gerrymandering. And so there's things that could be done. The Supreme Court now is, we're in turmoil on that. So I can't say that I'm optimistic, but I'm not pessimistic either. And the reason I'm not pessimistic is, what's that old saying? Why should you be optimistic? It's because we old people are going to die, basically. I gave a talk at the planning department. They had a big thing a couple of years ago, and I gave a lecture on that. And somebody asked me, and I said, well, old people are going to die. That's what's going to save us, And there's some truth to that. There's some truth to that in certain circles. So, even, I was just in Mississippi, and I was at Mississippi State University, and here right in the middle of the campus is this big statue of the first president of Mississippi State University in Starksville. And I'd not heard of the guy. His name is Stephen Dillon Lee, I think, something like that. And Stephen Dill Lee. And it said, Major General of the Confederate States of America, first inaugural inaugural president of the university. So I did a little looking at him. So what the heck is this thing doing out here in the middle of the campus, you know, right, the most prominent place on campus? And this guy was a self-proclaimed segregationist and identified himself as a white supremacist and led Jim Crow in Mississippi. And he was president of the university for 20 years. And they think that they're going to attract a lot of 40% of the population of Mississippi is Black. You know, that was what are they going to do with these young Black kids? They don't have a big Asian population, but why would a Black kid want to go there? You know, how do we integrate? You know, so they go to these predominantly Black schools, these historic land grant Black schools at Jackson State or wherever, and you know, isolated and separated. You know, you can't be a good ball player or a good tennis player unless you play with other good tennis players. That's what I always think. And you know, if you don't interact with who's ever doing the state of the art or don't have a chance for whatever reason, you know, it's gonna hurt you. So why the president, even now, I suppose there are laws against, I know in some states there are laws against removing these things. I'd take that thing off if I were president right now and I'd stick it in. You know, you got to acknowledge history, and people are victims, or they come out of their own individual historical environment, but you know, put that in a museum or some sort of heritage exhibit or something, but don't celebrate it in the center of campus right now. I mean, it's just, to me, it's just crazy. So those are the little tiny things that I really do believe, by the way, I know people may not agree with this, but I do really believe in this anti-racism, that, you know, idea that you know, it's not just a matter of being not racist, that you need to do something about changing the structural side, you know, the laws and the norms and the way we fund schools and all these issues that sort of keep us apart, you know, especially as we move towards a much more diverse society over the next 10 or 15 years. I mean, this change is going to come on us really, really fast, unless the baby boomers all live another 50 years, which I don't think so. We're going to have a lot of change, and it's going to be uneven change across the country. You know, I do a lot of work in rural areas, and you know, that racial change is very uneven. We've always had Blacks in the Delta and in the deep South, and Hispanics in the Southwest and along the Rio Grande and Indian reservations where I came from. But that's just a different kind of segregation. That's kind of a macro segregation, which I've tried to that's another thing, you know, that I've always saw it as a much more spatially comprehensive view of segregation. Why do we just focus on, you know, maybe 30–40% of the US population lives in central cities, in the biggest cities? You know, the majority of the population lives in suburbs. And then we've got this macro segregation that takes place in the ways I just described. We need a spatially inclusive perspective that acknowledges these larger regions, not just neighborhood to neighborhood. And I've focused my research on political units rather than neighborhoods per se, because I see cities or communities, municipalities, they're the ones who are imposing certain kinds of local tax rates, or they're funding the schools, or they're doing certain zoning practices. My wife, who's Jewish, you know, she is from northern New Jersey, west of the bridge, you know, and she, you know, all around her, they had all these exclusionary zoning laws that, you know, you couldn't do certain things, you couldn't sell to a Jew and so on. She always shows that stuff in her class. You know, that's the kind of structural racism or discrimination that, you know, it's not going to go away unless we do something about it. So but you know, I guess that's the woke culture.
Oh, sorry, Dennis,
No.
I want to acknowledge that we're all leaning on the edges of our seats because this is profound. And we're super interested. I want to pick up a little bit, if I could, on just what you've been saying for the last maybe 2 minutes on your ideas about maybe moving more into spatial data and spatial understanding of the things that you've just talked about. And I wonder if I could stimulate your thoughts by asking you, do you think that our very common jargon or lingo, things like flyover states, red states, blue states, you mentioned gerrymandering, do you think the language and the structures that we have now that denote spatial patterns are helping us or are hurting us? And do you think there's a different way to view ourselves as a nation, as multicultural, through spatial terms that we don't have now? And I'm sorry if that's maybe a complex question, but I'm hoping you
Well,
pick up on
yeah.
that.
No, I don't know if they help or hurt. I mean, they probably help in some cases just to communicate to a, you know, a less technical audience, but then they hurt because they obfuscate so much nuance. And so it's hard to make a blanket generalization. I mean, if you look at America, though, at least until the last decade, I mean, you know, basic migration had this equilibrating mechanism or a process that I think sort of smoothed out spatial inequalities. But I think those days are over. I mean, I don't think that's true anymore. And I don't know what the latest is. I haven't really followed that carefully, but I see a sort of macroeconomic and demographic segregation, not just, you know, you know, inner city neighborhoods, that sort of thing, which most people focus on. I just see a larger, and the blue states, red states, you know, I don't know if that's helpful or not. I mean, it's a shorthand for, you know, the reality of, you know, some states are predominantly Democrat and others are Republican. So I don't know how you would use different terms. The flyover thing, yeah, that's has a pejorative. I don't think that's very useful. So some are maybe more offensive and offending than others. But I don't know whether we would ever agree on any particular concepts, because, you know, these words mean different things to different people, I think, in different parts of the country. I mean, we got amazing cultural diversity in a lot of ways here. I think I wrote a thing maybe 25 years ago where I was talking about, I had somebody in the audience just really got on my case because I was saying, you know, I always think everything's, I mean, my bias, this is my bias. I think just somebody would ask me, what's you know, who's the best theorist today? And I'd always say, you know, IBM or something. I think so much social change is driven by technology. I mean, the spatial statistics, this hardware, the software, the mapping and all this stuff is just created a whole new world. It's also created sort of micro targeting with the media and so on. And that's where I wrote something about fragmentation back in the 90s. I've never been able to find, it was a chapter in a book, and I remember talking about how we're going to get fractured by the social media, because the radio stations, they had their little areas where you could get the radio show, you know, Hispanic radio show and the, you know, NPR, you know, different things in different parts, and they're really can target now. And it's hyper that today. And so we're creating our own little worlds, our own little fragmented worlds. And as you know, we don't know what the truth is. I wrote a thing with a colleague here about 3 or 4 years ago, just before the pandemic. And after Trump was elected, I said, and I wrote a thing, and I got some money for it to try to educate kids about disinformation and propaganda and so on. And but then I had a heart attack, I had bypass surgery, I had a pacemaker and all these things. And so I never actually got the study done, but you know, we've got an information problem here if we can't agree. And you guys know this, so I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I see it as a really major issue about social media fragmenting us. And I don't know how you get away from, I don't know how you get away from that in a democratic society. I'm not talking very much demography here, though, am I? Sorry.
Well, in a way you are. I mean,
Well, I
when
am in a way,
when
but it's sort of politicizing There was an article in Pop Studies here not too long ago about political demography. You know, there really is a demography of politics. There's no doubt of more than ever, as far as I'm concerned. Can't remember who wrote it. Maybe it was Bellari or somebody. Hillary. I just can't remember. It was in Pop Studies, but I thought it was very good. No, it wasn't Bellari. It was somebody from the old population bomb era, but I can't remember who it is right off the top of my head.
So I like all your empirical findings that do use real hard data. You take a look at segregation, you take a look at segregation, residential segregation, a variety of levels. You take a look at empirical data on education, empirical data on healthcare, all this stuff, which as far as I can see in terms of your findings, they're sobering with respect to racial diversity and integration. You're not finding too many optimistic empirical trends saying we're moving in the right direction, but you always have a little bit of an optimistic sort of overall perspective. This is what we've got to do, and we're not doing it, seems to be the sort of thrust. So I find it highly political in the sense it's always a call for action.
It is,
Look
but you
at
know,
the data no, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I get criticized sometimes because I don't really want to be an advocate though either. I want to be a social scientist, and I want to be careful about politicizing what I do. I know there's the public sociology, public social science element out there today, and you know I don't have any problem with that, but you know, I have people come up to me and they're just mad at me just out of the blue because I'm not political enough. I'm not, you know, some screaming. They think because I'm not screaming, you know, left-wing politics, that I'm really a really conservative scholar, because I don't, you know, and I had that especially when I was talking about family structure and poverty. I just had more people mad at me about and then it took Sarah McClanahan, I think, you know, a few years later to do stuff on, you know, family change and divorce and teen pregnancy, and you know, somebody legitimate to do it, then the field changed a little bit. But I had been working on that stuff, and I was always getting in trouble with somebody because everybody thought my argument was to, you know, if we just get women to be married and have babies and stay home and take care of their kids, we'd be a better place. And you know, I was just always raising issues and then letting the chips fall where they may, and then trying to understand them. I mean, that was sort of, and I didn't want to go, you know, I go beyond the data a bit, but I want to stay with the facts. I don't want to embellish the facts. I want to say what I think is true. And but people wanted different things from me sometimes. But I sort of feel vindicated on that issue, feel vindicated a bit on my presidential address, which irritated the economists and irritated some of the old-time race scholars. The youngsters in the field always liked that stuff that I did. They said, "Oh, this is sort of obvious, you know. I'm glad you're saying it." In fact, I did a retirement party. Had a retirement party last night, and an African-American, shouldn't say African-American, a woman who's African, she said that she would just was happy about my presidential address because she said, finally, people are paying attention to how the world's changing. And that's not the reaction I was getting from older white scholars of race, really. And so I sort of feel vindicated a little bit. So I was happy to hear that.
What did the older scholars say about your address?
Here's the kind of argument I would hear without trying to identify anybody, but basically the white population is going to decline, and it was going to create new opportunities for other minorities, basically. And you know, and that it probably can. But you know, people create laws, they do things that solidify their own privileged positions, and that's likely to go into hyperdrive when they feel threatened, you know, so. You know, and I use that word majority, minority. Some people don't like that. And maybe that's not one of those terms that's not a good term to use because it scares people, maybe scares some people, but I never use it as like, okay, we have a majority of minority people today. I always use it in the sense of we're becoming more diverse. We're becoming more diverse. We're going to be something if current trends continue, it's built into the system. Let's just acknowledge that and work toward improving that future because we're going to have an entirely different kind of population, I think. And then Dahlmeyer, I always appreciated Dahlmeyer because he wrote that book on about how we need to invest in younger minority people because, you know, they're going to have to take care of the baby boomers. They're going to have to take care of the old people, you know. And you see that everywhere. They're going to be paying the Social Security. They're going to be the child care. And you go to any big city hospital in any big city hospital, and who's there? You know, there's minorities. Even out in South Dakota and Mitchell, you know, the doctors tend to be minority immigrants, you know, of one sort or another. And even in State College, I mean, my cardiologist was from India. I got too many doctors here, but another doctor was from Iran. Another one was from Korea. She was an interesting person because she was married to, you know, I do a lot of work on interracial marriage too for the last 20 years, 25 years with Zen Xiaoqian. She was married. She had a picture on her thing, and I realized she's married to a white guy. You know, she's married to a white guy. So I naturally, being a patient, I asked her about her kids and how they identified racially. And so I've been sort of interested in this topic because we always talk about self-identified race, and it's, you know, parents are identifying their kids, you know. Who was ever filling out the survey is identifying the race of their kids. So I was asking her how they identified their kids at birth, and then how the kids themselves identified their kids, themselves. And she went through every kid, telling them how they only date Asian kids, or they just, all their friends are white, or, you know, just every one of those kids were different. And why were they different? Because phenotypically they look different. You know, they look different, and they sort of took on the racial identity of the people who viewed them. I mean, it's sort of the old looking glass self where people would assume the identity of what they thought other people were seeing of themselves. So that was an interesting question. So I got into research on that a little bit with Zen Xiaoqian because I was interested in if parents are defining their kids somehow as either white or black or mixed race. You know, the fastest growing population, I think maybe 10% now are mixed race. I mean, it's much higher than that because so many African Americans are of mixed race. Then, you know, you know, this is a one drop rule of people. They still identify and live in a culturally black world for the most part. But I was looking at how parents, you know, how the kid was identified by the parents depending on the relative levels of education. If one was native born, one was immigrant, the age difference, you know, a whole bunch of things that might indicate more power, and that, you know, and that was true. The more powerful spouse using these different measures, whether they took on that race or they were identified as such. And then, of course, as you'd expect, there were large differences in mixed, how kids were, whether multiple races were mentioned for the kid as opposed to mono race. So as you might expect, a lot of the black kids with a white parent or not, a white parent and a black parent would identify themselves as, the kid would be identified as black. You know, that's just sort of reinforces this sort of one drop rule.
Now, Dan, can I just jump in here for a second? Because you know, one of the things we're talking about here do go back to your presidential address. And I did notice that you do talk about Richard Albee, you talk about Del Myers, and all of you, I think, had a major impact in the last decade to get the OMB and Census Bureau to essentially do how we even ask the questions and then analyze the questions about race.
Right.
I mean, you know, Richard Alba really has with his latest book that both Dennis and I have reviewed, actually, turns out that, you know, he's just saying if you actually redefine who people are, we're not necessarily majority minority,
Right.
but we're
Right.
more majority. And so
Right.
it really depends on how you define it. Exactly like you were saying with how do mixed race people identify their kids? I mean, that's
Yeah, that's the question I'm interested in, and Richard's less interested in that. I've actually had a lot of conversations with Richard recently because we're trying to work together with one of these RDC, these data enclaves to get into some of the confidential data. Then we can find out who's actually filling out the survey. And you know, there's some sociologists that are talking about how racial and ethnic boundaries are you know, they're always in flux, or they're sort of dynamic, and they are. Is it because the kids, as they grow older, are getting redefined, or is it some new parent that's defining that kid, or grandma's defining that kid now, or the kid goes from 15 to 25, and now the kid says, oh, I'm defining myself, not mom. And so what's the change coming from? So what I want to do with those data is I want to actually link the racial identity over time, and also want to know who's actually filling out the survey, you know, because it's not self-identification. So that's what I'm interested. I think Richard is more interested in defining what is the mainstream, because historically, you know, the Irish were not defined as white, and Jews were not defined as white, and you know, they've been redefined as white in part because of upward mobility and so on. So, and he's optimistic in the sense that, you know, some part of the Hispanic population, maybe those with, you know, a European bent, are going to get redefined as part of the mainstream, and they'll be the new Irish or the new Jew. And you know, so that majority minority doesn't mean really very much, and I, you know, I agree with that to a big extent. So so what is the majority? The majority is we're just going to redefine whites in the future.
well, and thinking about that, I mean, going back to my mother-in-law growing up in South Dakota, she was the middle of 12 children, and she and her younger siblings didn't learn Danish as they were growing up because
Yeah.
about the time she was born, South Dakota had passed a law that you couldn't speak anything except English in public. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately, you know, said no, that's you can't do that. But her parents actually paid attention to that and spoke English only to her and to her siblings. So you know,
That's
even
interesting. You know, my grandmother, when she was alive, you know, she was born in 1900. I remember talking to 1900 was kind of an interesting year because, you know, she sort of came of age during the great, you know, the big influenza thing, and a lot of people out there died, and there was also the war. And being part of the German community, there are a lot of Germans at the time, you know, Lutheran Germans who hated the Catholic Germans and vice versa, and they had their little parcels of land and went to their different churches. They say, you know, the feds were in there all the time, scooping up people, and then they'd see them one day and not see them the next, and they never know whatever happened to them, whether they got deported or what. So there's really an incentive for, with the wars to assimilate. You know, we see that in big cities where we don't see the German parts of the town like we used to, or German restaurants. And she said they only spoke English. You know, they were assimilationists to the core. They wanted their kids to be Americans. And some of that came right out of that anti-Jewish or German sentiment at the time. I wish I could talk to her now that I know maybe a little more than I did. And there, you know, there's nothing much written about those sorts of things. You know, if you're in the middle of the heartland in rural America, I mean, who's gonna do that kind of work?
You know, at the very end of your presidential address, you make this diversity comment about demography, and I thought it was wonderful. You're saying that yeah, faculty in most American universities presumably will be replaced over the next decade by a new generation of educators and administrators with a much different racial and ethnic mix. Then you say, demography as a profession will and must diversify in terms of its practitioners, its subject matter, and its methodological approaches. And that's how you ended. And
I've forgotten that I'd put that in there. I had a much longer prescriptive discussion, and they were mad at me because it was too long, and it probably was, and it was. But yeah, no, I believe that, and I think corporate America knows that to be the case too, not just universities. Who cares about their employees, and their consumers and everything else? They got to get with the program. And the military also knows this. If you look at the military, they've done a good job in terms of talent, really. I mean, they know how to, they've diversified.
with respect to demography, what do you think new subject matter should be? And what do you think, what kind of new methodological approaches might come into play for our discipline? Subject matter.
I sort of feel like a dinosaur, because I'm always saying to my students, I said, you guys are going to need to define the questions. You guys are going to need to do stuff. And the reason I say that is because I don't know how many times I've heard senior scholars like myself poo-poo the younger generation. They're just not as good as we were. And then I would say, well, go back and look at an article in 1960 and judge its sophistication. Just go look. It'll be shocking. And the other thing is they say, the other thing they say is, I'm doing the best work probably I've ever done in my life. And I would say, I probably think that too. And I think it may be true. I said, but nobody gives a crap what you say anymore. Nobody cares about the questions you're raising. They have their own set of questions, their own friends. Of course, they don't like when I tell them this. They don't like when I tell them this, but I truly believe that. I mean, I think they're probably they know more than ever, and they can mobilize the troops to do good research. But I don't think they have a voice for the generation that's coming on board now. I just don't think they do. So the youngsters have to, they have to decide what's important, I think. And again, technology, I think in a lot of ways is going to drive that, just technology.
So,
I mean,
you don't have a clear vision of demography 30 years hence.
well, I mean, if you look at the past, here's what I thought was maybe 10, 12 years. When I was when I wrote the renewal at the Penn State, I just became director. I had like 6 months to get the thing done. Dennis Hogan had gone to Brown. And so I was trying to put this thing together. So I put together a spatial course. So the spatial technology stuff, I think, is really important for a lot of reasons, policy and otherwise. I think is just interesting. But it's very descriptive. Usually the econometricians are getting in there to do spatial econometry. What I thought was the big issue is I thought biodemography was going to be the issue, and nothing would get people more wound up than collecting biological data. And but we started. I had a little thing in our proposal about providing seed money to get some of these people to collect testosterone or other stress hormones and all these things, which I just thought was really, really interesting. But boy, people just reacted so negatively to that stuff. It sort of brought up the old, issues of eugenics and, but I always thought they had such an unsophisticated view of what was going on. So here's an example I was interested in behavioral genetics. I was interested in these sorts of things, but even things like, how your brain develops in adolescence. We know that kids do crazy things, they drink too much, they have unprotected sex. Well, their brains are just different. They're not developed yet, so they're doing stuff that, their executive function isn't quite right yet until there's things that affect the development of the executive function, the frontal cortex, the decision-making, stress and, parental care and nutrition, all these things. So to me, to know that, you could do some biology there. in the sense that you could, you might want to, it suggests to me as a caretaker, you might want to put some restrictions on your children, say, or certain ways of parenting and that sort of, or schools too. I mean, so, I mean, that would be one, sort of one thing, but, people react so negatively to that. And I think now people understand that it's both social and, genetic, and people have always known that. So it's always sort of an argument about what's more important. To me, what I don't like is when I see newspaper articles and talk about some hormone is related to some behavior, but I'm thinking about long-term social change. The biology does not, biology doesn't, in a population, doesn't change that fast. I mean, how are you going to get social change by knowing that, you got more kids today that their prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Or looking at differences across different societies and the like. So, I've been less interested in that, maybe in part because I think demographers aren't doing that like I think they were doing 20 years ago. I think they've sort of backed away from that. Although they are collecting fluid samples of all sorts, but they're not necessarily publishing them in the journals that maybe we know in demography, in the PA. I don't know if there's even any such sessions this time. But that was really a hot area for a while, and I thought that was the future. I remember somebody asked that very question about what's the future, and everybody was talking about these boring, I thought were kind of boring things. And I was kind of getting bored. There was like 5 of us, Barbara Entwistle and Phil Morgan, a lot of the luminaries, and they were saying, it's population aging, it's aging that's doing it, or it's immigration or something. I thought, well, these are all kind of, and I said, it's this issue of incorporating biology. And I think Robin Williams was at Irvine, and Robin Williams just went off on me for being interested in biology. And, but I think you can probably do it right. You just have to be careful, I don't know.
Good.
So are you, when you walk around PAA today, are you optimistic about the diversity and the changes?
PA is totally different in terms of its structure. I mean, it was mostly white males, but so much of demography has changed, and there's so much emphasis on family and fertility. I think that's brought in lots of women. And I just think the ASA and some of the professional organizations with some of their programs have attracted people to demography. I think the students themselves minority students find the issues that are covered in demography important and relevant to their own personal life. So they're getting into it. And you see it with our kids today. It's just amazing to me. I think it's all for the better. But we'll see. Sometimes when you feminize a discipline or you change the racial structure of the discipline, you may lose something with other more powerful groups, but we'll see. I'm optimistic about that part of it. I think we're going to raise better and better questions all the time. And there has been a democratization of demographic data that I think has led to a democratization of ideas too, because everybody now really is a demographer. I mean, they can jump in, grab all kinds of census data, do all kinds of things that you couldn't do in the old days when you were relying on a big population center like Wisconsin, where you had staff to spin tapes and, you needed a computer and you needed some expertise to run data. And everybody can do it on their laptop today in some ways. And it's so much easier to use data sets. So I think that's all good. But of course, it makes the boundaries of demography kind of difficult to define. And I think some people worry about that. A lot of stuff in demography, especially around health, that was, when I was editor of demography, we rarely published anything really on health or that was epidemiology, and we rarely published anything on public policy. That should go in a public policy journal. I mean, there was stuff on the big pictures of population health, but not like today. And now, the old traditional areas are, just aren't attracting the same level of interest, I don't think. So what is demography? Well, John, put that in your next book. What is demography? It's just not fertility, mortality, migration. People are interested in a lot of things that are either demographic in their own right or have demographic implications or demographic origins of some sort. So,
But Dan, you said it earlier, as I've said for a long time, demography is everything and everything is demography. I mean, that really is the case. I mean, that's really what you're saying is that the field gets bigger because as more data and more understanding of demography gets out there, everybody does, whether they realize what they're saying or not, they are getting into the mold of demography matters to everything.
right. And, the newspapers, they have their own staff. They're out there doing stuff, New York Times, Washington Post, they have their own technical staff that can do a lot of this stuff now without any problem. That just wasn't possible in the past. So they're marketing demography too. People see the obvious link between demography and voting patterns, for example. I mean, it's just apparent, self-evident. And so it's last night, I think I said, it's a good time to be a demographer because everything is linked to, whether it's population aging and having Social Security, or whether it's diversity and school integration and better outcomes for minority kids, whatever it is, there's a demographic angle to this.
Can I ask you, I heard a presentation this morning and I think I saw your name as one of the co-authors on in the section on masculinity.
Oh, yeah.
And Trump voters, young men as Trump.
Well, did you guys hear that the question?
Actually, I did not know.
I have a paper with my longtime colleague, Zhen Chao Chen, and there's a kid from Bocconi University. His dad's an economist at the University of Warsaw. But Francesco Bellardi flew him over because this kid wanted to do some work on intermarriage. And so he wanted to meet with Zhen Chao and me. And so, I drove up to Brown. He spent a couple of weeks at Brown, and then we talked him into doing certain things. And of course, he didn't do anything we said we wanted him to do. But we never saw the paper until he sent it to the discussant just a couple of days ago. So we weren't quite sure what he was actually going to do. But here's the thing. He didn't do it, but here's the thing. He was interested in sort of a masculinity threat from high achieving women. They have more education than men, better jobs, often are good jobs. They don't need a man to support themselves and necessarily. And so we were trying to understand with voting data on Trump over the last couple cycles, whether these men in certain kinds of occupations were voting in particular ways. But what I wanted him to do, and he didn't do it, but I wanted him to get into the sort of rural vote and the incel, or what do they call is it the incels?
Incels, yeah.
Incels, the incels, these guys who can't find a woman. We have the same issue, sex ratio imbalances and so on in the Middle East, where, a lot of the political foment comes from, women are the great civilizers. That probably sounds like a sexist thing, but when you look historically at how well men do, I mean, men behave better when they're in a partnership. And we see it on most land grant schools with big engineering programs or agricultural programs or whatever that came up where overwhelmingly were male. Those tend to be big party schools, It's like the wild, wild west, And so, that's basically where the ideas come in. Women, if the men don't have partners, and they can't command, attract a woman or a partner, they're going to get resentful and they'll become more easily want to go back. They're more easily radicalized, and they're going to be more likely to vote for Trump and join some rural militia group or whatever. So we're a bit a ways from where Sen Chow and I wanted them to be. We're meeting with them in the morning. But it's sort of an interesting idea, and it's we'll see. So if there's no partner, I mean, if you look at rural America, I mean, women tend to leave more than the men do. There's nothing there for women, but the men are, working in agriculture, they're working in town, they're in their pop's business or whatever the case may be. But the sex ratios in some of those small towns for young adults are pretty negative for men. So, what are they going to do? They're going to eat hot dogs and get their AR-15s and join the group, And so that's sort of that's kind of the stylized way we're thinking about that issue. And, there's some evidence that that's the case, but we need to do a lot more work on that paper before it's ready for submission anywhere. I wrote a paper a couple of years ago that was in Journal of Marriage and the Family, and I couldn't do the work, but I was at BYU and I was talking to an economist. I said, what if we just thought that all the unmarried women or all the unmarried men were anybody who was not married, we would call them missing, we would treat them as missing data. And then say, if men or women married in the same way that men and women marry today, what's the nature of their partners? We could identify how many of these sort of counterfactual males or females that were out there for them to marry. So we're basically saying we were actually calculating shortages of men and women on the basis of the observed marriage patterns of the currently married. And when you do that, there's gigantic shortages of highly educated men for highly educated women to marry, the economically under, and I think in that paper, it sort of went viral because they put out a press release. I was calling them economically unattractive males. And those guys were not getting married. There were just a complete shortage of women available for those guys to marry. And it's even related to things like situational homosexuality. So you see in the Ozarks where men who don't have partners are getting involved in homosexual relationships. It's just a whole area of research that we don't know very much about, but there's a few little things here and there. So I'm sort of interested in this ENSEL movement, but we haven't really done it right yet.
Yeah, but it's fascinating.
But I think it's a good topic right now, especially in rural areas where there are shortages. You've seen those dating apps where it's farmers only or whatever. They're trying to get men out into these rural areas. That's just not here in the United States. It's in China, it's in Southeast Asia, it's in Korea. Korea imports, 10% of their babies are born by women who are not Korean. They're brought in from other countries, and Korean language is a tough language to learn. And those kids, I guess, from those mixed marriages, those mixed by nationality marriages are, they're in rural areas. Don't get the support. And those kids are not doing very well in school right now. And of course, we already know that Korea has an extraordinarily low fertility rate,
Listen, Dan, I think honestly, we could all spend a lot more time talking with you. This has been really, really wonderful. Technically, our reservation in the room where you're sitting is up in about 5 minutes. And I don't want people bursting in on us. I don't know whether that's going to be the case or not. And of course, you guys who are there in New Orleans have a PAA presidential address to get to in a little while. But is there any one last thing that you think we should know for the record here before we conclude?
No, I'm happy to chat here, and I probably look at all these issues a little differently than some. I always think my background is my biggest advantage. Big family, living in a rural area. I can talk to my colleagues at Cornell, and I remember a few times in the faculty meetings, I'd say, all of you have parents that are professors? Sort of the intergenerational things. And You know, so I'm always the sort of outlier in terms of social class. You know, I'm going, you know, I'll be at meetings and the department head will have her cup of Starbucks and she'll see me and say, I see you got your cup of Dunkin' Donut coffee and stuff, you know. So I'm trying to, so I guess, you know, I see myself as sort of a marginal man. I don't quite fit into, you know, any place in particular. I certainly don't fit into my parents' environment. But I don't always fit very well into, you know, sort of the educated elite class either.
We think you fit in really, really well. Certainly with us, no question about that.
And I'm kind of a troublemaker at faculty meetings. That's the other thing. You know, I'm the only one who has a joke periodically. And the economists, I try to get them to laugh, you know, and I do get them to laugh occasionally. I start making fun of them about the indoctrination problem or something, you know.
Well,
So anyway, thank you for the opportunity.
okay, listen,
Well, thank you.
thank you
Thank
so
you.
much
I
for
enjoyed it.
meeting with us, and we really, really appreciate that. And we will be back in touch when we get the transcription and everything so that we can relive this moment.
Okay, thanks so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, take
Bye,
care,
bye.
everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Kind of went off the rail there.